he bought her loyalty with a sack of flour and the promise of a roof against the biting wind. The man, Caleb, was a creature of the unforgiving plains, his heart a fallow field where grief had frozen the soil solid. His hands were calloused from work and his words were stones dropped into a well of silence. When Serafina stood before him, her two small children clinging to her worn skirt like desperate vines, he saw not a woman but a solution. His house was a hollow thing, an echo of a life lost to fever and dust, and he needed hands to sweep away the ghosts. She had looked at him, her eyes holding the last embers of a burnt-out hope, and uttered the words that would bind them. "I'll be loyal forever, Master, if you spare my children from starving tonight." He did not offer a hand, only a curt nod. The transaction was complete. He led them not to the main house, but to the old line shack, a place of drafts and shadows. It was enough. For her, it was a fortress. For him, it was a boundary. He left them with the flour, a side of bacon, and the cold, unspoken terms of their arrangement. She would work, and in return, her children would not die. That night, as the prairie wind howled its lonely sermon, Caleb sat in his dark house, the silence he had cultivated now disturbed by the faint, alien sounds of life from the shack, a mother's soft hum, a child's sleepy sigh. It was a crack in the ice, infinitesimally small, but it was there. Serafina began her work not with the resentment of a servant, but with the quiet desperation of a builder. Her first act was to wage war on the dust, the thick, grey shroud that covered every surface of Caleb's home, a physical manifestation of his untended sorrow. She swept the floors until the planks of wood remembered their grain. She washed the single window in the kitchen until the morning light, once a pale intruder, now spilled across the room in a warm, golden sheet. She found a chipped tin mug and, on her way from the well, plucked a handful of stubborn prairie wildflowers, placing them on the table. It was a small, defiant act of beauty in a house that had forgotten such a language. Caleb would come in from the fields, his face a mask of grim exhaustion, and stop. His eyes would catch the glint of light on the clean window, the impossible splash of purple and yellow on his table. He never spoke of it. He would eat the food she prepared, stew that tasted of the earth, bread that smelled of a warm hearth he hadn't known in years, and the silence would stretch between them. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer empty, it was filled with the scent of baking bread, the sight of mended curtains, the quiet, rhythmic sounds of a house being coaxed back to life. She was a ghost of a different sort, not one of loss, but one of patient, persistent grace, and he found himself watching her hands as she worked, marveling at their competence and their gentleness. The children were the first to cross the invisible line Caleb had drawn around his heart. The boy, Leo, was a miniature version of his mother, quiet and watchful, his small shoulders already squared with a premature sense of duty. He would gather kindling or help carry water, his eyes always on Caleb, wary but not afraid. It was the girl, Rose, who was the true catalyst, her innocence a force too pure for the walls he had built. She did not understand the cold bargain that had brought them here. She only saw a tall, sad man who lived in the big house. One afternoon, she found a hawk's feather, a perfect thing of brown and white, and ran to him where he stood mending a harness on the porch. She held it up to him, her small hand a cup of offering. Caleb froze, his large, capable hand suddenly clumsy. He did not know how to receive such a simple, unconditional gift. He merely grunted and looked away, but he did not brush her aside. Days later, Rose stood before the stone fireplace, her gaze fixed on a small, silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece, the only trace of his late wife, Mary, that he had not packed away. Her face was a blur of sepia and time. Rose turned to him, her expression one of solemn curiosity, and asked a question that struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Was she your sunshine?" The child's simple, poetic truth shattered the air. Sunshine. He had not thought of Mary in terms of light for years, only in terms of the darkness her absence had left behind. He could not answer. He simply turned and walked out of the house, the little girl's question echoing in the vast, roaring silence of his soul. The question lingered for days, a persistent ghost at his shoulder. "Was she your sunshine?" It forced him to remember the curve of Mary's smile, the way her laughter had filled the very rafters of the house he now found so suffocatingly quiet. The memories were agonizing, a thaw that hurt more than the frozen numbness. He found himself changing, the shifts so subtle he was barely aware of them himself. He began leaving an extra apple on the porch rail of the shack in the mornings. When he butchered a hog, he set aside the best cuts for Serafina, telling himself it was merely practical, that a strong worker needed proper fuel. But he knew it was more than that. He watched her from his window as she taught Leo how to patch a tear in his trousers, her head bent close to his, her voice a low murmur. He saw her lift Rose into her arms, burying her face in the child's hair, and the fierce, protective love in that gesture resonated with a part of him he thought had been amputated. One evening, he came into the kitchen to find her pouring water into the tin mug of wildflowers. His tin mug. The one he'd used for years, dented and stained. He said nothing, but the next morning, when she served him coffee, he drank it from that very mug, a silent acknowledgement, a shared piece of territory. The ice was not gone, but it was cracking, groaning under the unfamiliar weight of warmth and life, preparing to break apart. He was beginning to see Serafina not as the woman he had bought, but as the woman who was quietly, insistently, saving him from the wreckage of his own making. The sky turned the color of a bruise that winter, and the wind began to speak in a low, menacing snarl. A blizzard descended upon the plains not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a ravenous white beast, devouring the horizon and erasing the world. It howled and clawed at the little house, piling drifts against the doors and windows, isolating them completely. Inside, a different kind of storm was gathering. Rose, who had been coughing for a day, began to burn with a fever that stole the color from her cheeks and put a glassy, unfocused look in her eyes. The sound of her shallow, rattling breaths filled the small shack, and then the main house, as Serafina, her face pale with terror, carried her daughter inside and laid her before the fire. For Caleb, the sight was a recurring nightmare made real. The fever, the labored breathing, the desperate, helpless love of a parent, it was the same story that had stolen Mary from him. The memory was a physical paralysis. He saw not Rose, but his wife, her life slipping away in this very room. He felt the same uselessness, the same impotent rage against a sickness he could not fight. He backed away, his hands clenched into fists, his breath caught in his throat. He was a capable man, a man who could tame the land and bend nature to his will, but in the face of this, he was as helpless as a child. He retreated to the darkest corner of the room, a spectator to his own worst fears, frozen by the past while Serafina fought for the future. Serafina did not have the luxury of succumbing to memory. Her fear was a sharp, immediate thing, a blade against her throat that demanded action. She looked at Caleb, saw the ghost in his eyes, and knew in an instant that she was alone in this fight. A fierce, maternal strength surged through her, pushing aside the terror. She would not let this prairie take another child. She moved with a desperate, focused energy, her every action a prayer. She sent Leo to fetch snow, which she melted and mixed with the dried herbs she had painstakingly gathered in the fall, yarrow to break the fever, peppermint to soothe the child's tortured breathing. She tore strips from one of her few good petticoats, soaking them in cool water and laying them on Rose's burning forehead. She spoke to her daughter in a low, ceaseless murmur, her voice a lifeline in the disorienting sea of fever. Caleb watched, mesmerized by her resolve. He saw no panic, only purpose. Her strength was a rebuke to his own paralysis. Shamed into action, he moved from the shadows. "More wood," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He went out into the screaming wind, the cold biting at his skin, and returned with his arms full, feeding the fire until it roared, a bastion of warmth against the encroaching cold. He brought her water. He held the lamp steady. He was no longer the master, nor was he a frozen statue of grief. He was her silent, willing assistant in the desperate battle, his actions a slow, painful surrender to the present moment, to the woman who refused to let the past claim another victory within the walls of his home. The night stretched into an eternity, marked only by the rhythm of the howling wind and Rose's fevered breaths. In the flickering firelight, the boundaries between them dissolved. They were simply two people, stripped of their history and their bargain, united in a single, desperate vigil. In a moment of quiet, as Serafina gently spooned a cooled herbal tea between Rose's lips, Caleb spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Mary," he said, the name an artifact unearthed after years of being buried. Her fever was like this. I did nothing. I knew nothing. It was not an explanation, it was a confession, a raw wound exposed to the air. Serafina did not look at him, her attention wholly on her daughter, but she heard the lifetime of pain in those few words. You are doing something now, she replied, her voice soft but firm. It was not absolution, but it was an acknowledgement. It was grace. As the first pale, grey light of dawn filtered through the snow-caked window, the crisis passed. The fever broke. Rose's breathing eased, and she fell into a deep, natural sleep, her small hand clutching her mother's finger. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion settled over the room, but it was mingled with the electric hum of relief. Caleb looked at Serafina, her face smudged with soot and etched with fatigue, and he saw a beauty and a strength that humbled him to his very core. He saw the woman who had not only saved her child, but had also pulled him from the wreckage of his own grief. The silence that fell between them now was not empty or cold, it was a shared space, a vessel holding the weight of what they had just endured together, a foundation for something new being laid in the heart of the storm. Weeks after the blizzard receded, leaving the world scoured clean and gleaming, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was a man from Serafina's past, her late husband's brother, Marcus, a man with a ferret's eyes and a soul shriveled by petty grievances. He had heard she was working for the reclusive rancher and had come to claim what he felt was his, not Serafina, but a share of her good fortune, or at the very least, the authority to drag her and the children back to a life of destitution under his thumb. He dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the tidy porch, the mended fence. Well, well, he sneered, his eyes landing on Serafina as she stepped out of the house. Found yourself a comfortable spot, have you? Living off the charity of a stranger. The town council was thinking it's time the children were placed in the orphanage. A more suitable environment, his words were a public condemnation, designed to strip her of her dignity, to remind her of her place as a beggar. Caleb had been in the barn, but he emerged now, drawn by the venom in the man's tone. He moved not with haste, but with a slow, deliberate weight that seemed to make the very ground tremble. He did not look at Marcus. He looked at Serafina, and in his eyes was a cold, protective fire. He stepped forward, placing himself between Marcus and the woman and her children, a human shield. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and resonant, carrying the authority of the land itself. She is not a beggar, he said, the words as solid as granite. This is her home. These are her children. And they are under my protection. He reached down and rested a hand on Leo's shoulder, a silent, irrefutable claim. The declaration hung in the air, absolute and final. Marcus, faced with a will far stronger than his own, faltered, stammered, and then retreated, a lesser predator driven from its territory. The departure of Marcus was more than the removal of a threat, it was the final crumbling of the old arrangement. Caleb's words, spoken in the clear light of day, had been a vow, and it had changed everything. As winter's iron grip gave way to the tender green of spring, a new dynamic took root and began to grow. The line between the shack and the house dissolved. Serafina and the children moved into the main house, filling its empty rooms with the quiet hum of family. The days fell into a new, gentle rhythm. Caleb would take Leo with him to mend fences or check on the cattle, teaching the boy the language of the land not with lectures, but with shared work and patient hands. He showed him how to read the clouds and how to listen to the wind. In the afternoons, Serafina would work in the small garden she had planted near the kitchen door, Rose at her side, her small hands patting the dark, rich earth. They planted vegetables for the table and a few rugged flowers, determined to make the stubborn soil bloom. Laughter, a sound long extinct in that place, began to be heard, first from the children, a bright, startling melody, and then, one day, a low, rough chuckle from Caleb himself, a sound so unexpected it surprised even him. The house was no longer a monument to a ghost, it was a living, breathing home, its warmth radiating from the inside out. The wildflowers in the tin mug were replaced by cuttings from their own garden, a testament to the life they were building together, seed by patient seed. One evening, as the setting sun painted the vast sky in hues of amber and rose, Caleb came inside to find Serafina sitting by the fire, the basket of mending in her lap. The light caught the silver threads in her hair and softened the weary lines around her eyes. He watched her for a long moment, the quiet competence of her hands, the peaceful set of her shoulders. She had taken the broken pieces of his life and her own, and with infinite patience, had stitched them into a whole and beautiful quilt. He walked over to her, his shadow falling across her work. She looked up, her expression calm, questioning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple object that seemed to glow in the firelight. It was a silver ring, worn smooth with time. It was not Mary's. It was new, purchased on a rare trip to town, an act of intention, a choice for the future, not a relic of the past. He held it out to her, his calloused palm a stark contrast to its delicate gleam. He did not have the words for poetry or grand declarations. His language was one of action, of truth spoken plainly. "This belongs here," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. It was more than a proposal, it was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of a truth that had grown between them in the silence and the storms. Serafina looked from the ring to his eyes, and in their depths, she saw not a master, but a partner. She saw home. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek as she nodded, a silent, profound acceptance. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and outside, the last light of day faded, leaving the four of them in the warm, steady glow of the hearth. The journey from a cold transaction to a warm, beating heart of a family shows us that the deepest bonds are often forged in the harshest winters. Caleb and Serafina's story is a powerful reminder that even the most frozen ground can be thawed by persistent warmth, and that true strength isn't about building walls, but about having the courage to let them down. They prove that a home is not built with wooden nails, but with courage, grace, and the quiet promise of protection. Their love story, born from desperation, reminds us all that hope can take root in the most unlikely of places. If their journey from hardship to healing touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these inspirational stories to life. Click that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a tale of resilience and redemption. Thank you for watching.